First of all, Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, for those of you who aren't really familiar with them, there are 8 small unpopulated islands, no water, no power, no people. They're located in the East China Sea, about 120 nautical miles northeast of Taiwan, 200 miles east of mainland China, 200 miles southwest of Okinawa Prefecture in Japan, separated by the Okinawa Trough, which is the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. China claims that separation as a factor that says the islands really broke off from the Asian continent. Japan says if we can't see it, we don't even know it's there. This is the book that we're actually discussing today, and it came out about August 15th. And in order to write the book, I put together a research team. I'm limited by that uniquely American inability to speak foreign languages. And so there was no way I was going to be able to do a media study of Chinese, Japanese, and US media without building a team. And luckily, I get to Asia often, and I know lots of very smart Asian scholars. And so these are the participants who wrote chapters in the book. Hiroko Akudo and Shubo Lee each wrote chapters that I'll only very, very briefly talk about that focus on textbooks. Because what I was interested in determining is how Chinese and Japanese students learn about these disputes. Because textbooks are a way governments prepare the fertile ground to create citizens with a certain kind of national identity. Takeshi Suzuki and Shisuke Murai wrote the 2 chapters on Japanese legacy media and Japanese social media, talking about how the controversy was understood in Japan. John, who you're going to hear from, wrote the chapter on Chinese legacy media. And Elaine Yuan and Miao Feng wrote the chapter that looked at Chinese social media, primarily Weibo. And then Patty wrote a chapter looking at how this kind of controversy has consequence for global disputes generally and how to think about strategies for moving forward and trying to solve them. I'm not in this talk going to spend much time on theoretical foundations because I know I have a lot of researchers or a lot of folks here who aren't communication researchers, but these are the theories I heavily drew upon in the book. The one I will talk about is the first one, media diplomacy. And by media diplomacy, what we were interested in learning is how governments use the media to talk to multiple stakeholder publics. So when a government minister issues a statement, they do so with the knowledge that it's going to be understood by a local domestic audience, the audience of the other, in this case a Japanese public audience or a US public audience, as well as Japanese and US officials, of course, as well as the public audiences across the globe. And it used to be that diplomats or foreign officials could say one thing to a domestic audience and something else to a foreign audience. That's not the case anymore. Even in a country with a very controlled social media system such as China, there are 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States, and they're all reading global media and interacting via email and Weibo with people at home or WeChat. So that's primarily what we're about, is looking at how media plays a role in shaping this controversy, and I draw on those other theories as well. Just very quickly, the 2 historical claims that are at odds. Japan says they found these islands in the 1880s and they were unoccupied by anyone. So in 1895, the prefecture of Okinawa put a marker on them, claiming them for Japan. China and Taiwan say these islands have been Chinese since at least the 16th century. China says Japan seized those islands during the First Sino-Japan War, when it was being an oppressive imperialist power in the region, and it cites the 1943 Cairo Declaration as saying Japan is compelled to return all territory stolen from the Chinese. Taiwan says the islands further appear in the San Francisco Treaty, which negotiates the end of World War II, which reaffirms that Japan has to renounce all territories stolen. China says, wait a second, we weren't invited to the party in San Francisco since they weren't yet recognized by the US or allied powers, and so we won't depend upon that treaty for the basis of our claim, but since Taiwan is part of China, and if the islands are part of Taiwan, then clearly the islands are part of China as well. The US makes a mess of this dispute. We occupy the islands in Okinawa at the end of World War II. We use them for artillery practice. In 1971, Nixon returns Okinawa and the islands to Japan. As you know, at the time, he's trying to get rapprochement with Beijing. He's trying to open up China before the '72 election. He doesn't want to provoke Japan any more than he has to about their anxiety. He doesn't want to provoke the pro-Taiwan lobby in the United States, which he's quite anxious about. So this seems to be the easiest decision. I'll give these islands back to Japan, but I'll do so while asserting that we take no position on who actually owns them. And of course, that non-resolution kicks the can down the road, as we say, and makes the dispute worse. It comes to a head in 2012, really, when the Tokyo governor puts together an online appeal to raise money to buy the islands for the city of Tokyo. The Japanese government steps in. It's at this point a more liberal DPJ government. They don't want the radical rightist Tokyo governor potentially creating incidents on the islands, so they nationalize the islands and say the government will buy them. But they certainly didn't communicate their intention very effectively with either Beijing or Taiwan, because if they thought that was going to narrow the disagreement that the islands were shifting from private ownership to government ownership, they were absolutely wrong. And of course, it resulted in all kinds of protests. I'm not going to talk about these because I know John is going to talk about these, so I'm just going to slide by these. But this is what happens in the region when we get suddenly ships coming from China and Japan, and they're multiply trying to now patrol these regions. We get ships shouldering each other. We get very aggressive situations where they shine the lights onto the bridge of a ship or use water cannons. The danger, of course, becoming that any miscalculation, a renegade captain, a misstep of error quickly creates an escalation scenario. The United States says, wait a second, we are the hegemonic military authority in this region, so President Obama moves 2 U.S. aircraft carriers, the Ronald Reagan and the Stennis, into the region and parks them right off the shore in international waters and says to China, you want to mess with the big dog? We're the big dog, come at us. So China springs a bunch of fighter planes into the air, and we get all these planes that are now closely competing and confronting each other, including an incident up over Diaoyu Senkaku, where there's almost a near miss between a Chinese and a Japanese plane. After the near miss, the Chinese plane rolls like this, showing that he's fully armed, which is, of course, itself a provocative act. You just have a near miss. I think I'm flying over international waters before I enter Diaoyu. Luckily, there isn't a miscalculation at that point. China declares a no-fly zone. The U.S. tells our airlines to honor the no-fly zone by telling them when we're coming through the Diaoyu region. Japan puts out an order to its airlines that they cannot notify China when they fly through that zone. So if you want to safely fly from Tokyo to, let's say, Hong Kong, you might not want to choose a Japanese airline in the near future. Interestingly, by the way, the U.S., in the response to that Chinese action, flies a B-52 bomber right through the middle of the zone, saying, we're not going to alert you. We still consider this to be waters that we can safely fly. So we have a real kind of a aggravation of tension and anxiety, and it could lead easily by miscalculation to war. The chapter on textbooks, I'm not going to take the time to talk about it. I'm sorry, I just don't have time. Other than to say that the way Chinese textbooks are written emphasizes that China today is strong, largely because of the product and achievement of the CCP leadership. And that China historically was weak because it was picked upon by foreign powers, European powers during the time of the Opium Wars, of course, and the United States played a hand in that, and most notoriously by Japan. When Japan features in Chinese textbooks, it is almost always featured as a hostile enemy of the people of China. And from middle school, elementary school, high school, Chinese students are told that China is free today because the CCP is strong enough to stand up to this form of aggression, and Japan is characterized today as continuing to be hostile toward China and other nations for the fact that it's unrepentant about its war crimes. This chapter was done by Shubo Lee of the University of Oslo. In contrast, Japanese textbooks tell a very different story. They minimize any real discussion of potential atrocities in World War II. This chapter by Hiroko Ikuda said when they refer to potential atrocities, the Japanese textbooks tend to say things like, some allege, or it's been claimed that Japanese may have committed atrocities, but all that language kind of minimizes. Instead, what the focus of the Japanese textbook is Japan's role post World War II during the Cold War as a bulwark of freedom, explicitly created as a contrast to China. And so Japan characterizes its identity and its role for its students as important to stand up as a source of democracy and freedom that stands off the shore of China, ready to protect Asia and represent the democratic hegemony. The islands, starting in the 1970s, only when oil and gas might allegedly have been found in the region, came to be shifted in Japanese textbooks as falling under the category of koyo no ryodo, which includes them in the notion of land that originally belonged to Japan. Historically, this language, that term of phrase, only referred to the 5 core islands of Japan. But when the islands get written by textbook standards starting in the 1970s, notice that they recapture this land to say, of course these islands are Japanese, and they've always been Japanese. So interesting contrast in chapters. And I'm going to pass over this one. We'll talk about that really after John talks. Give me 2 minutes to talk what happens in social media. What I want to do at this point with the remainder of my time, and I don't have a lot, is to talk about what happens. Well, no, I'm going to back up a little bit. I have to do this. I'm sorry. Even though John's going to talk about Japanese legacy media, I'll come back to this one, or Chinese legacy media, I'll come back to after. But I want to give you a sense of Japanese legacy media, okay, before I talk about the US. Japanese legacy media does not question in any reporting the claims of Japanese ownership of the islands. In other words, if you read the Daily Yomiuri or the Asahi Shimbun or any of the Japanese newspapers or look at NHK Broadcasting, you see that the media faithfully accounts for the perspective that, of course, these islands are Japanese. There is no ambiguity, there's no uncertainty, there's no questioning. And the media asserts that, of course, Japan's position is supported by the whole rest of the world. And that's going to be important because you're going to find some parallels in John's discussion about how they're covered as well in China. And the island controversy is credited in Japanese media as being responsible for the loss of the DPJ political regime and the return to power of Mr. Abe. So the islands are constructed as, of course, naturally Japanese. Our position is supported by everyone. And the underlying encouraging narrative is that Japan should take tough positions because that's how Japan finds the greatest strength in the world. In social media in Japan, the island controversy is radicalized and becomes of interest only to the ultra-right nationalists in Japan. If you don't have an ultra-right position on Japan, you're not going to write about these islands on social media. The conversation is only of interest to those who are very strongly supportive of the nationalist positions. Of course, the islands are ours. It is also a site for a lot of anti-Chinese and anti-Korean postings, all right? So these inflamed rightist messages affect a lot of other issues, and the social media users claim that they're responsible uniquely for the return of Mr. Abe to power. This form of media on Japanese social media also circulates a lot of anti-legacy media narratives. So the social media users will tell each other, you can't believe the legitimate normal press because they don't tell you the whole truth. If you want the whole truth, you have to come to social media and get it. And there's an example for that. I think I have time to tell this example. There was the occasion where the Chinese fishing boat collides with the Japanese patrol boat. You may remember that incident if you followed this controversy. Japanese legacy media released a videotape of the collision soon after it occurred. And the videotape made it difficult to tell which boat was at fault, but said this happened, and it happened in the area near the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. The guy who took the video took it on a mobile phone. And he was unhappy with the portions of the video that were released, so he released the entire video on Japanese social media. And the entire video shows that the incident was provoked by the Chinese fishing boat captain who runs into the Japanese patrol boat. So the argument the social media users is your government and your media don't want you to know how weak we are in the face of a strong China, and how they failed to stand up to China because they released this shipping boat captain rather than prosecuting him for invading Japanese territory. When in fact, in contrast, they arrest Japanese people who go to these islands. So this anti-legacy media narrative itself became a very interesting dimension of this coverage because right-wing media, or right-wing social media users say you can't trust the mainstream press anymore. And that, of course, has consequence. Now I want to shift just for the remainder of my time, and then we'll get to John to talk about China and Patty to talk about the suggested solutions. How does this get reported in the US? And why should we care how this gets reported in the US? And what I'll tell you first of all is this issue does get ample coverage in leading legacy media in the United States. If you read the New York Times, the LA Times, the Post, if you read the business press, you will be familiar with Diaoyu Senkaku controversy. But what we know is 73% of Americans tell pollsters they don't read legacy media anymore. They get their news from television news. And if you watch television news in the United States, the only thing you would know about Diaoyu Senkaku controversy was that there were some protests for a few days in China against Japanese people, because that's the only coverage it got. Indeed, I can tell you that even my academic colleagues would say, "What are you working on?" And I said, "A book on the Diaoyu Senkaku controversy." And they said, "Where is that? What's that?" Americans know nothing about this. Now, why does that matter? What we do get told by our media is that these are rocky islands, uninhabited, bare, isolated specks. They're certainly not cast as sacred national territory the way they're depicted in both Chinese and Japanese media. Not deserving US press would say of a game of chicken where two powerful countries risk going to war over these islands. There's a narrative about oil, but everything you read in the US press about the oil says it's going to be almost impossible to exploit that oil. It's the deepest part of the ocean. It's an oil foundation sedimented by a history of earthquakes in the region, so it would be very difficult to dig. And this is the most typhoon-prone part of the Pacific. And every time a typhoon comes through, the rigs would have to pull up their oil rig and get their people off the platforms, right? So the argument in US media is, look, there is no way this is a legitimate fight if the fight is about resources. The fight has to be about something else. And if it's about something else, what is it? Well, it's these other things that aren't necessarily productive or helpful. It's one controversy out of many, the media says, that China has with other countries in the region. So the dominant press frame in the United States about this issue is that China is upsetting an apple cart of stability. China is not winning friends, China is making enemies. And the media narratives here say its new wealth has created an arrogant, aggressive, and expansionist China. And it's created a China that's militarizing in a way all out of proportion to its needs so that it can throw its weight around. The US media says that in fact the CCP uses this controversy to distract its citizens from its real problems. They say, look here, don't look over there, don't breathe your air or eat your food or use that cooking oil. Think about Diaoyu Senkaku. And that Xi Jinping has used the issue to prove that he is tough, and that for Xi the issue is personal because he just doesn't like Abe. So these are all very common press frames that appear in US media coverage to explain the islands. The US media also emphasizes that China encourages anti-Japanese sentiments. These are fireworks that are sold for National Humiliation Day. Clay, can you read that box?
Not from here, but yes. In the past, they sold these things about blowing up Tokyo.
Yeah, well, that's the bottom one, I think.
The first part, yeah.
Okay, so these are fireworks that are sold, you know, the Diaoyu Islands are ours and bomb Tokyo. And that they've intentionally ratcheted up this kind of hostility. This is particularly true according to US press narratives with regard to the protest actions. So the argument in the US press is that the Japanese or the Chinese government not only permitted these protests, they actually tolerated and encouraged these protests against Japan to occur. There are stories in US media that says reporters for American media organizations got SMS messages in the morning to say, you want a good story today? Go cover the anti-Japanese protest that's going to occur, right? And so this was an attempt to really stir up the controversy and send the world a message that the Chinese people were really upset with this. They cracked down only when the protests turned violent and when in fact there could be damage to actual Japanese firms that could cost Chinese jobs. So in the US narrative, this is all a manufactured kind of controversy. In contrast to the way China is characterized, US media sees Japan as this pacifist nation, deeply anxious about the rise of China, maybe worried about its own shrinking role in the world, but definitely depicted as the rational actor in this confrontation. China is exuberant, out of control, brash, challenging its neighbors. Japan is this rational, they're our friends kind of action. Okay? And there's no questioning in US media. US audiences would have no reason to question the argument that Japan's intentions were all good. There is some criticism, as you know, of Japan in US media narratives, and mostly this does have to do with the failure to acknowledge war crimes. and the visits by Abe and members of his administration to the shrine that honors Class 1 war criminals. Abe is frequently, in fact, almost every news story in the US about Japan will define Abe as a hawk and his government as nationalist. But most of the focus here is on the actual risks of the confrontation. So rather than locating the responsibility and looking for a solution, most US press coverage says, look, this is really a situation that is fraught with danger, that is way out of proportion to its importance or its potential benefit. There is no recognition in the US media coverage of any US culpability or blame for the crisis, right? Uncle Sam is literally closing his eyes to this one, and no sense of how the US could play a useful role to help resolve the controversy. The argument that we make, and Patty is going to be talking about this, is you can't get government policymakers and citizens to begin thinking about engaging in solving a controversy if they don't have press reporting, media accounts, and diplomatic guidance from the administration suggesting possible ways to look forward. And of course, we're so consumed with anxiety about the Middle East or maybe about the Ukraine that there's no focus on this issue really at all. There are also inconsistent diplomatic statements. For the first time, Secretary Hagel said these islands were covered by the US security agreement with Japan. And he said that in a statement in Tokyo. He used the term Senkaku only. He doesn't mention Diaoyu when he says that. The story by Hagel gets virtually no discussion in US media, but it is, of course, everywhere in Japanese media, and it's solidly condemned in Chinese media. Several days go by before the administration gives a follow-up statement to say, yeah, that's what we really meant. So 2 days after the Hagel statement, what discussion you do see in US media is discussion saying, did he get out ahead of us? Is that like a mistake? And then finally, President Obama issues a statement saying, no, we really meant that. But nobody really knows if that was a pre-planned statement or if they at that point didn't want to just make the Secretary of Defense look weak or send another message of weakness to China that could be taken as in any way a sign that the US would not stand by. The important thing I would say, though, is Japan is telling its people that the US has our back in this controversy. And in the United States, I don't think there's any reason to believe the American people would have their back, because I don't think the American people would be interested in engaging in a conflict of any kind with China over an issue where it's just they've been told it's bare specks of rock, right? A recent poll of a year and a half ago said only 30% of Americans would support a military confrontation with China to protect Taiwan. So if we're unprepared to protect a democracy that's been our ally for many years, and a trading partner, and a place that sends us students and has family relationships, you should be skeptical that we would step in the case of Diaoyu Senkaku. U.S. is depicted in all positive language in our own media narratives. So the emphasis in the U.S. press is statements by our diplomats that say things like, we've brought 7 decades of peace to the region, the U.S. presence has controlled nuclear proliferation, absent U.S. participation, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, maybe even Vietnam would all be getting their own nuclear weapons. So China should be thanking us, Japan should be thanking us, not engaging in brinkmanship. What's totally missing in US coverage is the legitimacy of competing ownership claims. I mean, there is a historical way to at least assess arguments about which country makes a better claim to these islands. An American media user would never have any idea how to evaluate that. There is no discussion of the credibility of the US security commitment to Japan, and this is a big deal, folks. If Japan provokes an incident with China, even an accidental escalation incident, and the United States steps in, what message do we send to Japan or South Korea or Taiwan or any other country that may be holding what they think is a US security agreement? So I think this is really a major story, and we could see a fundamental shift in a very quick short time frame if there begins to be not only a material loss of respect for the US security commitment, but a perceived loss of respect. This is particularly the case, by the way, when we're now debating things like whether cyber incursions constitute violations of treaty abrogation. So if there's an official hacking that seems to be supported, for instance, by China against Japan or the US, does that fall under a treaty provision? This is the same argument that came up in NATO, for example, when the Russians used cyber warfare in the Baltic region. and have used it also against Georgia. So there's a lot of challenges here. There's no discussion in US media about why China might be militarizing. You know, the very fact that China gets most of its resources from outside China and obviously sends most of its finished goods to countries outside China suggests that China has a strong interest in stable sea lanes. Patty and I do a lot of work with US Navy leaders, and they'll say things like, why is China building an aircraft carrier? And these are Navy admirals sometimes. Why does China need an aircraft carrier? I'll say, excuse me, Admiral, how many does the US have? The answer is 12 operational at the moment. So if US has 12 and thinks that's what we need, why shouldn't China think it needs? Especially since all its wealthy cities are on its coast, right? And it has the history of the Opium Wars. But there is almost no kind of media conversation about China's development of hard power resources that would help citizens understand that issue. So I'm going to come back to my summary because I think I'm going to get a chance to do that after John talks. John, why don't you bring your slides up and talk about Chinese legacy media. What's going to happen after that is I'm going to take just a 2-second thing to talk about Chinese social media, and then Patty will talk about steps forward.
I will today talk about how this controversy was reported by Chinese legacy media. And the news source I choose from the Chinese side is basically from Xinhua News Agency and Xinwen on CCTV. As you may know, Xinhua News Agency is one of the biggest national news agency in China, and most of the stories circulated by Xinhua News Agency we can find like in different newspapers in China, so they can face the largest readership in China in press. And Xinwen on CCTV is still one of the most viewed news program in China because every day still from 7 to 7:30 p.m. not only CCTV channels will distribute this program, also all the provincial satellite TV channel will broadcast the same news content. So I suppose these two channels can reach the biggest audience in China. So I try to collect all the news reports from these two resources, including the Chinese version and English version on Xinhua News Agency from 2011 to 2013, with a focus on during the 2 months in August and September of 2012. Actually, Diaoyu Island is not a new topic in China before August and September of 2012. For example, in 2011, I can already see some news reports about Diaoyu Island, either about China would continue its patrol to protect the Chinese fishermen there, or to criticize on Japanese textbooks, or to see Japan stop to make any dangerous activities in the area. And also those reports always show the attitude China is like open to cooperate, to work with Japan for the future to promote the stability and peace of the region. On August 15 in 2012, 14 Hong Kongese activists, they were like arrested by Japanese police when they went to Diaoyu Island to show their, to protect islands, to claim that the island belonged to China. And what happened there caused a condensed media exposure in China. And following that, in September, on 10 September of 2012, the Japanese government, as Tom already introduced, they officially announced that they will purchase the islands, and this immediately caused a huge reaction in China. And we can see different ways how the legacy media reported on the controversy. And the attitudes, for sure, I mean, all the Chinese news stories, they repeat again and again those islands belong to China. And they also, in order to respond to what Japanese called the island was not occupied till the 1885, China listed like different historical documents as well as ancient maps to see that these islands belong to China already in history before. And China was beyond all the doubt on the island. And 2 weeks after Japanese government announced to purchase the islands, the white paper about Diaoyu Island was published by the Foreign Ministry in China. and with all those details included. And not only attitudes were emphasized time and time again, also different actions by different administrative offices in China were all well documented on the Chinese legacy media. We can see either like to launch the ocean satellite to make sure the remote control on the islands, or the publication of territorial coordinates, geographic codes, were also documented on Chinese legacy media. And from September of 2012 to September of 2013, there were in total 59 times of surveillance ship patrol in the Diaoyu Island. You can see on the right picture. And not only this, Chinese legacy media also covered about how the fishing boat from Taiwan went to Diaoyu Island to claim that the islands belong to China. It means that on the Diaoyu Island issue, mainland China and Taiwan will work together against Japan's claims. And what is interesting is to see when Xi Jinping, the new leadership, come into power after November of 2012, different levels of military movements can be found on legacy media reporting. For example, the first surveillance aircraft was sent to Diaoyu Island in history for the first time. And also, the large scale of Navy exercises were taking place in China East Sea. And also, the white paper of the development of Chinese military, as well as the air defense and identification zone, were also reported by the legacy media due to the time. And about protests, as Tom said before, like the US media, most of them, they will have their focus to look at how those anti-Japanese protests were going on in China during those times. And also Chinese legacy media also somehow paid attention to those protests, and it's very interesting to see how they report about them. There were actually two waves of the protests in China. The first wave happened after those Hong Kong activists were arrested, and it's between August 15 to 16. And here is one picture of one protest happened in Chengdu, a city in the southwest of China. And Xinhua News Agency called those protests at that time overall peaceful. And then after August 16th, there's no more report can be found on Xinhua. And CCTV, the Xinhua Lianbo didn't cover any protests during the first wave. And the second wave starts after September 10 and 11, after the Japanese announced that they will purchase the islands. And then from Xinhua only reported some protests on September 10 and 11. And I'm sorry. And then after that, till 18th of September, no more reports can be found on Xinhua. Actually, every day every day the protest is still happening everywhere in China. And if we look at one picture in front of the Japanese embassy in Beijing on September the 11th, we can see those protesters may not be so peaceful as what described by Xinhua at that time. And they are really get angry with Japanese, and they want to crash into the embassy and to do something. But as Xinhua recorded, still there were no aggressive behavior. And after that, as I said, till September 18, because September 18 is a memorable date into Chinese history, because that was like the day when Japan invaded China during the Second World War. So we were supposed to have a larger scale of protests by that date. But if I look at the news, CCTV reported briefly some small protests in different places on that day. And Xinhua News Agency on that day didn't talk anything about protests in mainland China. Instead, Xinhua talked about like protests happening in Hong Kong, in Macau, or some overseas cities by Chinese overseas. And one of the reasons may due to like from September 10 till 18, during this week, there were too many protests happening everywhere, and some of those protests went violent. For example, the bigger picture shows one protester in Shenzhen clashed down one shop selling Japanese products in China. And the other picture was actually the most terrible tragedy happened in Xi'an. It's a driver of a Toyota car, and he was like dragged out and beaten on the ground, and was quite serious at that time. And no news can be found on Xinhua and CCTV about that kind of tragedy. But at least I found Beijing News Daily as the only source I found reported about what happened in Xi'an. And also this newspaper also called for like to calm down the protests and to be more rational when you protest Diaoyu Islands. Do not continue to do those stupid things to hurt ourselves. And international support is also another focus from Chinese legacy media during those times. And they quoted international experts as well as international media to see how they were criticizing on Japan's move. And also different open letters from Chinese ambassadors everywhere, like in Europe, like also Clay mentioned a little bit, like in Germany, in France, in many other countries. They were very well reported also on the Chinese legacy media to show that China is in its own rational and deliberated way to appeal the islands belonging to China. And they also focus as China is still open to talk, open to communicate with Japan to solve this issue. And also those protests, as I mentioned, as Xinhua reported overseas, they were also considered as one kind of international support. Even those protests were still carried out by Chinese overseas, but they were still considered as a kind of international support from the Chinese legacy media point of view. And also there's another focus is to look at how U.S. Attitude is towards the Diaoyu Island issue. And the Chinese legacy media tried to send signals to say to America not to take any sides, try to be out of this issue. And when, for example, when Hillary Clinton made her speech about like the administrative authority of the islands belong to Japan. After this statement came out, Chinese legacy media fiercely refused it, and they call it a kind of mixed and wrong signal. And this kind of bias towards Japan and against China will eventually undermine the peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. And it's even more interesting to look at how legacy media in China look at Japan's reaction on this. From here, we can see the only side, those positive sentences from Japanese politicians. For example, the first one was the Minister of Foreign Ministry in Japan, and it was during a press conference, and from CCTV Xinwen Lianbo, the reporter interviewed him, and he said something like the two nations should strengthen cooperation in different areas. And also, even still now, it's difficult for Xi Jinping to meet Abe, but actually, in the beginning of 2013, Yamaguchi is the leader of another party in Japan. Actually, he already visited China, and Xi Jinping met him. And also, like this kind of joint action to solve the problem was also quoted by Chinese legacy media. So they only documented those positive feedbacks from the Japanese side to let the Chinese audience to understand what is going on. Yeah, so to summarize, it's like we can see Chinese legacy media always claim like the China's sovereignty over the islands was beyond all doubts, and also they blame Japan for triggering this mess. It's like China was only responding to what the Japanese government was doing, and it is the fault of the Japanese side to cause what's happening in China, I mean also between the two nations. And also they highlight China's reaction, no matter it's like at different actions or China's like all the military exercises, they were all rational, and now China is raising up to a serious level to face the island issue. International support was also emphasized on Chinese legacy media, and about the protests in China, they give limited space to report those protests in mainland China, especially after those violence turned out. And the Xinhua News Agency at least switched their focus to look at the protests overseas. And also they send signal to the United States of not taking any sides. And we can also see after the new leadership come into power, different military actions were highlighted on the Chinese legacy media. And that's all, and then Tom will talk about social media in China a little bit.
Both Japanese and Chinese legacy media affirm the national government's position without any criticism and essentially say, we're the rational actor, the other side is causing all the problem. Interestingly, what also happens in Chinese social media, and I'm talking now about the chapter by Miao Feng and Elaine Yuan, is Weibo posts are again completely dominated by the ultra-rightists in China. And if you're not an ultra-rightist, if you're not really worried about Diaoyu, you're not writing at all. So when they do their data search, they don't find posts that say, we're spending too much of our time and attention on Diaoyu. If Diaoyu gets mentioned, it's being mentioned by people saying, this is really a huge problem and we have to be worried about it. What this study also found was that the protests on Weibo quickly turned into protests against China as well as against Japan. So that there's a mark where the Weibo posts begin to say, our government's not tough enough. Our government should be more aggressive. Our government should be more hostile. You can search that up. We should.
They're waiting for the mic.
Oh, we shouldn't be allowing Japan to push us around like that. And what the authors find is, as soon as those negative posts go up on Weibo, they get taken down within an hour or two. Because we know that China's Great Firewall is reading Weibo and is taking up and taking down messages as needed. The clear argument for that, though, is a country that uses media to aggravate its public runs the risk of quickly overheating that public passion, and social media intensifies and radicalizes that opinion, and the opinion can turn quickly against the PRC government and not just against the Chinese or Japanese.
Good afternoon. I am also going to skip some slides, and I'm so glad this isn't an engineering audience because they hate it when you do that. We're going to go through really quickly. The chapter that I did had 3 purposes. The first one was to set up a new theoretical approach to looking at media diplomacy in international disputes, and I'm going to skip over that. The second issue was to try to look specifically at some of the territorial issues, and I will talk about that a little bit. But then the last thing is to do what Tom was talking about and start talking about how you might be able to use a frame of media diplomacy to look at potential ways forward. One of the things that Clay did not mention is that I run a research lab called the Scenario Lab. And the Scenario Lab works with companies, it works with governments, it works with different military groups. And the idea is, how do you create alternative, plausible stories of the future? And so the idea is, how might, a controversy like this start to develop a new set of stories? And so one of the things that we're trying to do in looking at the perspective this way is to shift from a hard power, power politics perspective to a more media perspective. And that means that it's not so much about military expenditures. This, for example, if you look at all global military expenditures, that's the US, that's China, and then this is the rest of the world, right? And so if we're talking just in terms of military, there is a very difficult problem that diplomats have trying to get away from military confrontation as one of the stories. But there's a new perspective that says international politics these days, as the US finds itself continually mired in the Middle East and unable necessarily to do whatever it was trying to do with the pivot in the Pacific, is very, very focused now on trying to create a better story moving forward, one that's not dependent on the military, but instead dependent on how is it that we might be able to operate more in this global cosmopolitan environment. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're saying if you look at this from a communication lens, there's a whole body of literature on strategic communication and how it is that you can be stakeholder-centric across lots of different stakeholders, how you can create stories that move across different kinds of national divides and tries to look at people, especially with a new focus on social media where people believe that they're really quite instrumental in perhaps the election of officials or other ways in which countries decide how they're going to move forward. But that if you start looking at all of these people as co-creators and collaborators of the new story, then in this notion of media diplomacy, just having all of these different arenas of communication becomes one of the goals. And so one of the things that we tried to do in this particular case is look at this island dispute, not just because it's got military consequences, but to look at it as an archetypal example of a certain sort that lives in the world, and that is territorial disputes. And if you look at territorial disputes, they have some very interesting things about them. One is in terms of different kinds of diplomatic disagreements, territorial disputes tend to be the most enduring. They are the most likely to end up in military conflict. And one of the things is that a lot of the previous work that was done in international relations and in diplomacy on how you resolve these issues, and one of Zan's last slides talked about we'll leave this dispute for generations of the future. It turns out that that doesn't really work very well. One of the things that we know is that there is an escalation of these kinds of territorial entrenchments. We now have very, very good data that shows that as you look, the longer a dispute lasts, the less likely it is to be resolved without military conflict. And sometimes military conflict that doesn't end, you know, and you can use several examples in the Middle East right now. There are different ways in which this happens over time. The three most important are material, functional, and symbolic entrenchment. And I think that you just got a really good sense that we're seeing all three operate in this particular example, which is what makes it interesting. You've got much, much more difficulty now separating it from the homeland, these particular islands. The notion of functional entrenchment, we heard a lot about this when we were in Japan, and I think we'll have a little bit of time to talk about how those conversations went. And then this notion of symbolic entrenchment, you really get that with, you know, this is something that's historically important. I've known this since I was in, you know, 6th grade or whatever. So at any rate, there are all of these issues around the practices where we are looking at something, you know, that is a little bit bigger and broader than just this case, but you see patterns of behavior that cut across lots of different countries and lots of different disputes. I think the most interesting is the notion of coercive diplomacy. And so if you look at how these kinds of negotiations have happened in private, which is where diplomacy used to mostly take place, was in private between, negotiators from different countries, but now it's happening in public. The public is now unhappy with a lot of the long-standing patterns. In Japan, for example, this notion of, China asks us to do this and Japan very quietly will do it, right? And so you've got lots of ways in which this could end up badly. There are lots of people, Steve Nagy, for example, I passed over a slide earlier where he says this is one of the really severe potential disasters of the world because we've got, a lot of military firepower in a very small amount of space. And so that gives it the possibility for a very rapid escalation. It's the possibility that even something could go wrong accidentally. And then all of a sudden you move into a scenario that is pre-planned. I've spent the last 15 to 20 years of my life working with the American government and the military and NATO leaders. And one of the things that you learn is there's a plan for everything, right? And there is a plan that the US has for what happens if this escalates. And it's not a pretty plan, right? And so one of the things that you try to do is you try to think about this is just, a small microcosm of the ways in which military plans could escalate over time. And being mired in territorial disputes makes sure that you can't engage in a lot of the most important, perhaps bilateral or regional relationships that countries have to do in order to be successful. So one of the things that our lab is doing is they're working on this notion of a resilient future. What are some alternative plausible scenarios that would allow the countries to come together, even if the two heads, even if Xi and Abe never actually meet to talk about this, although I think they probably will. But it's how can you create a new story going forward? And so one of the first things that you have to be able to do is you've got to be able to create a new set of arguments that are not based historically, right? Because right now we're seeing that being, mired in your history is going to get you nowhere. There will come a point in time where China's sheer size will allow it to dictate, but that's probably, especially with the US backing Japan, we're at least 50 to 75 years out, and a lot could go wrong in that time. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're talking about what kinds of stories might create an operational consensus. And so an operational consensus, one, privileges future concerns over past disputes, right? And so you get people together on a completely different topic. Right now, my favorite idea is that they might do it over climate change, global warming, kinds of issues. It's a real important issue in both countries. China's air is, something that's in the news almost daily. Japan has, a lot of damage that's coming from different kinds of issues related to global warming, like typhoons. And then you've got the idea that these are just rocks and they could very easily just disappear. And so as we start to see, the oceans rise, I think you can create a very good story around the idea that these are purely and simply rocks. They won't even be islands anymore, right? So one of the other things that you could look at is you could look at shifting the messenger. So that instead of having a lot of this talk come from central government, that you instead shift this to business communities. There are the largest number of workable contracts, business contracts, right now in all of Asia are between China and Japan. And so if you look at how that could be a way forward to make the key negotiators, as it were, of the new story to be business leaders, and then we'd be able to look at different kinds of academic exchanges and other ways in which people can move forward. So I will let Tom summarize.
The takeaway of the book is that in both China and Japan, this controversy is looked at through primarily historical frames. And in the United States, there's a willingness to disregard history in our historical role and to focus only on right now. And to say, why are these two countries, the second and third largest economy in the world, at war with each other or potentially risking a war over these bare specks of rock? In no country, in neither China, Japan, or the US, is there forward-thinking media reporting, statements by political figures about what a sustainable future could be like. We were pleased, Patty and I just came back from China and Tokyo, and we were pleased that while we were there, they had the first meeting of maritime officers, commissioners from China and Japan, met in Qingdao for the first time since 2003, and the island controversy was, quote, briefly discussed. We saw no discussion of that discussion in either Chinese or Japanese media. It gets mentioned in the Asia edition of the Wall Street Journal. What is likely to hopefully come is if tensions can diffuse and people can begin having those kinds of meetings, what's likely to occur is not a change of anything major like either country denying its sovereignty claims, but that what could possibly happen is they'll change the, quote, rules of engagement. In other words, the operational rules of the kind that Patty refers to, the orders to commanders operating in the area, ship commanders, airplane pilots, etc., will be a different set of protocols about what protecting this sovereign territory means. And that's a way that countries can maybe quietly back down without provoking their own publics. Because remember, if I've ratcheted up this anxiety and now I compromise, I look weak. And whether you're Abe or Xi Jinping or Barack Obama, no political leader wants to look weak in the eyes of his or her own people or in the eyes of the world.